I'm very happy to introduce Eliani Rivera Velasquez, Research Associate at Centro, who has worked on many projects relating to popular culture in the Caribbean, queer culture in the Caribbean, and is co-editing a forthcoming special issue of Centro Journal looking at the relations between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. So ideal person to moderate our next panel.
It is my great pleasure to introduce two of our panelists today. The first panelist I'm going to introduce is Veronica Davila, who uses pronouns they, them. Dr. Veronica Davila Ellis is an assistant professor of Spanish and Latinx studies at James Madison University. Their research and teaching focuses on the music production of women and queer artists of reggaeton, dembow, and other Puerto Rican and Dominican genres, with an emphasis on sound studies and queer theory. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, they received their PhD from Northwestern University in 2020 and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Smith College from 2020 to 2022. They have published articles for the Oxford American, Revista de Estudios de Género y Sexualidades, NACLA y 80 Grados. Our other panelist is Dosandri Mendoza, who uses pronouns she and they. Dosandri Mendoza is a PhD student in linguistics at UC Santa Barbara, specializing in sociocultural linguistics, queer trans Puerto Rican performance, and drag and ballroom culture. They are body Cuban, gender fluid, queer femme, originally from Miami, Florida, a UC Doctoral Studies Fellow, and a former recipient of the Doberman Sal Fellowship for the Center for LGBTQ Studies in New York. From dressing in drag for his music videos to expressing support for the trans community in Puerto Rico, Bad Bunny has sometimes been seen as an outlier in the genre of reggaeton, an artist that subverts the machista and homophobic stereotypes common in the genre. However, he's not the first or the only artist to do so, and many in the LGBTQIA+ community believe more attention should be paid to performers who explicitly identify as queer. In this panel, we will discuss these questions as well as think about the role of reggaeton and perreo and how it can and what role it can play in imagining our queer futures. Without further ado, we're going to start today with Veronica.
Thank you, Eliani, and thank you everyone at Centro for the invitation. I'm excited to join this panel and my fellow panelists. I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you. So I'm a scholar of reggaeton, but specifically I'm a scholar of femme and queer reggaeton from the Dominican Republic. So what I'll do today, my contribution is going to focus on the sounds of queerness in Dominican reggaeton and how these genres have been used to develop queer political positionalities by communities of Dominican descent, both in the DR, in Puerto Rico, and in the diaspora. So my goals here are twofold. I want to shed light on the ways that queerness and queer identities have thrived in Dominican reggaeton and dembow. And if you're not familiar with Dominican dembow, it's sort of an offshoot of reggaeton developed in the mid-2000s. If that still doesn't help you, La Romana, Bad Bunny, and El Alfa, it's that sound in the latter half of the song that is dembow. I'm doing this by emphasizing the essential contributors, and I want to give credit to the queer fans and audiences that are part of these cultural scenes as crucial supporters of reggaeton and dembow, regardless of the gender and sexual identities of the performers or even the gendered positionalities and discourses espoused in their lyrics. So during my research investigating the development of dembow, it's been evident that women and openly LGBTQ+ artists have been embraced by audiences and have enjoyed relative success for longer than queer and femme people in Puerto Rican reggaeton seem to have. Now we've seen a boom of a lot of queer Puerto Rican reggaeton and trap artists, but this has been happening for a long time in the DR. The reason why there has historically been such a disproportionate difference in gender identity amongst Puerto Rican and Dominican reggaeton performers is part of the questions that drive my overall research. I suspected that the structures of support that have been so essential for the prosperity of genres such as reggaeton function rather differently within Dominican working class and economically segregated communities. In general, these communities retain the grassroots sort of underground nature that we saw in early Puerto Rican reggaeton. Of course, just like any other popular music genre, dembow and reggaeton songs express lyrics that perpetuate misogyny and homophobia. It's a reflection of our society's perceptions of women and LGBTQ+ people. However, while in many popular music genres, recording and performing conditions actively discourage women and more so LGBTQ+ folks from participating, in the DR, queer aspiring dembow artists, often from working class communities, have been able to create and sustain networks made specially to support them as queer performers. They navigate homophobic and transmisogynist spaces by partnering with key producers, catering to cis-het perceptions of queer realities, and harnessing the agency that queer audiences exert over the music that they consume. So who are the queer performers of dembow? One of the first openly queer and trans dembow artists is La Elfie. Although La Elfie passed away in early 2020 at just 28 years old, so we don't have her with us anymore, queer and cisgender straight folks alike regard her as a groundbreaking dembow artist, still highly influential for aspiring LGBTQ+ artists that wish to write and perform music from their queer positionalities. So I want us to hear a clip of La Delfi's, one of the most famous songs is called Dame Leche, Cocoro, and it's where the title of my presentation comes from. This is a 2011 song, get ready. Okay, so you can hear that the song incorporates the underground style composition of the late 90s Puerto Rican reggaeton, which is a staple of Dominican dembow, and it's what the sound that Dominican dembow takes specifically. La Delfi's transformation of the colloquial phrase "Tamo en coro," we're in community, in this song has become a slogan for queer youth in the DR, and it has been used to gather in community and transform social spaces across the country. Parties such as El Cocoro del Futuro, gatherings in places like La Fábrica Contemporánea, La Espiral, Mamey, or even in the public Parque Duarte, which is famous for being the preferred spot for alternative indie rockers and queer people, use the word cocoro, right? They repeat cocoro following the conventions of the dembow genre, where singers repeat phrases or words at the beat of the dembow. But its circulation through social media hashtags and its enunciation by queer Dominican grassroots organizers means activating the linguistic, sonic, and embodied sensual playfulness that Afro-Caribbean genres such as dembow and reggaeton offer us, using the repetitive utterance as a tool for coming together and sounding out queer genders and sexualities. Tamo en coro has become a way to intervene in heteronormative spaces and to create networks of solidarity for LGBTQ+ folks in the DR and beyond. And here are some pictures of El Cocoro and some of the fabulous work that Dominican drag artists do. A musical instance of Puerto Rican and Dominican kinship is illustrative of La Delfi's impact across the Caribbean. In the chorus for the single Cáscara de Coco of the Puerto Rican trans rapper Villano Antillano, probably the most important trapper right now, Villana sings, "Voy sacando leche como Delfi Cocoroco." By quoting Dame Leche, Villana renders homage to the queer reggaeton pioneer and symbolically is also alluding to the ways that Puerto Ricans and Dominicans together have activated Cocoro through reggaeton. For instance, collaborations between Dominican drag group Draguealo and Puerto Rican Vogue and ball collective Labor y Vogue, Plataforma Eje and Circuito Queer in El Plumerío, Cruces Caribeños de Ball and Performance, and you can see Celiani in the picture there. These events are an example of the centrality that reggaeton and dembow have for liberatory queer practices across the Spanish Caribbean. Similarly, queer organizers in Puerto Rico have used dembow and reggaeton as ways to connect with pleasure and dissidents when curating events such as La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción reggaeton parties, where the slogan is "Si no puedo perrear no es mi revolución," or the community space El Hangar end of the year party de Marquesina and other perreo-centered gatherings where all of the DJs are queer DJs. We can even include here the Perreo Combativo, spearheaded by queer and trans activists during the protests that took down the governor, or even thinking about the weekend dances amongst working class gay people in El Cojo in Puerto Rico. These instances have important trans-Caribbean connections across queer, Black, and working class communities from Hispaniola to Puerto Rico, where the most radical of reggaeton's political roots are consciously activated to include and provide space for queer bodies and their realities. So more than a celebration of visibility, the queer folks that mix, sample, play, dance, and sing along to reggaeton and dembow in these events are impacting how the LGBTQ+ community engages with Caribbean expressive culture. These efforts are influencing the sonic and performative transformations that reggaeton and dembow are going through. So Raúl Alejandro's latest album basically is all taken from these practices. So in the Dominican context, I've witnessed how queer fans sustain both the commercial and the non-mainstream productions of dembow and reggaeton. In consequence, many artists have started to include the audience's queer identities and positionalities, of course not always accurately, into their live shows and music videos. For instance, as part of a presentation in the DR by one of the dembow artists that I researched, La Insuperable, a routine twerking context took place on stage. This always happens in her concerts. During this context, the singer brings in a trans woman from the audience to compete and upstage the other women and celebrates her defiance, elegance, and skills. There's a trans women will express the way that La Insuperable is the model, right, that they follow for their own lives. Women and femme audience members have also harnessed women dembow artist concert venues as places to express queer affection without the danger of persecution that they could experience elsewhere. Some trans and gender nonconforming audience members have shared with me the importance of such moments of visibility and the positive impact that allowing expressions of queer affection during cis heteronormative performance events has had on them. They express the desire to be recognized as music fans with agency, much in the same ways that someone like Ivy Queen has done for her own queer followers, right? They're also highly conscious of the problematic and violent ways in which cishet managers and producers capitalize on their queer gestures, tokenize trans music fans, and enforce male gaze frameworks onto expressions of queer femme desire. So with the recent popularity and controversies around Tokischa, by far most transgressive queer dembow artists, there seems to have opened a conversation around radical femme and queer identities, particularly in light of the state's constant censorship and prosecution of such expressions of femme sexuality, alongside with Tokischa's international prominence. La Delphi and Tokischa's success in the dembow scene are telling of the strategies that openly queer, gender-defying, and anti-respectability performers employ in order to thrive within highly violent and dangerous entertainment spaces. Tokischa was able to rapidly climb to international stages, given her collaborations with cishet dembow rappers, her espousal of other seemingly illicit behaviors, such as recreational marijuana use, and by reappropriating the language of objectification found through dembow music to speak about her sexuality and queerness. La Delphi, in turn, was supported not only by DJ Blue Boy, who produced Dame Leche, but also by Lápiz Consciente, a Dominican rap pioneer who fostered her radical cross-dressing aesthetics and embraced her explicit descriptions of gay sex, as well as her feminized vocal performance. As Dominican music scholars have observed, La Delphi's performance uses stereotypes of effeminate gay men along with hypermasculine reggaeton vocalists to humorously critique gender in the Dominican music. Certainly, Dominican popular music has always allowed for a parodic and humorous inclusion of non-normative masculine and gay performance, particularly as they're used as rhetoric strategies that reproduce patriarchal discourses around men's virility as the mark of masculinity and therefore effeminacy as inferior and undesirable. Finally, I want to bring in a last group that bears importance for understanding the breadth of Dominican queer reggaeton and dembow. While many of the mentioned artists enjoy somewhat mainstream recognition locally and amongst Dominican and Puerto Rican diaspora, there's a growing scene of alternative reggaeton music, of which one trio of queer women stands out. So I'm highlighting Mula here as a case of non-commercial and genre-defined music group that at its core is interested in the sounds and experiences of queer Black Caribbean joy. The ability to work outside of commercial culture allows them, for instance, to record music that acts as a form of counter-memory for the LGBTQ+ community in the DR. While not readily considered dembow and reggaeton, it's important to take Mula's productions as examples of queer ways of performing and making reggaeton. They defy the market-driven structures of the Latinx pop music industry and instead embrace DIY approaches to collaborate across countries and languages, driving forth messages that recognize the cultural multiplicities that Caribbean queers inhabit. This type of collaborative work is not restricted to the alternative or DIY, neither it is something that only musicians in the DR are interested in. The work of Puerto Rican artists such as Villana, that I mentioned, but also Ana Macho, Young Miko, and Rainao, to name a few, consciously recall the legacies of Dominican femme and trans artists. Doing so allows them to rewrite the process and strategies for reggaeton as a political practice, one that can be embedded within queer organizing. And these artists are also recognizing, honoring, and restoring the centrality that queer Dominican creators have for the development of reggaeton. Thank you.
I'd like to start with apologizing for single-handedly raising the temperature of the room. I'm sorry. Thank you. So just to reiterate, my name is Dosandri Mendoza. Mis pronombres son they, she, ella, y ella. I'm a PhD student in linguistics at UC Santa Barbara. Up front, I'll give kind of a content warning for transphobia with a few rather violent examples. There's no graphic representations of them, just both a discussion of media accounts and my own personal experience. So I have a title, just for my own. I love titles. Anyone knows me, I love a good title. But the title is Conejo Semiotics, Queer Dialogic Intimacy and Bad Bunny's Performance Repertoire. But I'm hoping to leave the presentation more as an opening to generate conversation, rather than some type of argumentative arc that kind of forecloses different readings. So I encourage that. So I'm starting today with the particular framing of thinking with Bad Bunny, taking his performance repertoire seriously to a point, for the sake of making points about the queerness of the genre, not kind of romanticizing it as new, as Rivera Rido has already given us space to think with Jackie Alexander about particularly reggaeton as a site of black femme erotic autonomy, and challenging already kind of these forms of white cis heteropatriarchy. I'm also interested in the queer possibility in the genre, the complications for the flourishing of that possibility, and making a final appeal for a move beyond Bad Bunny, a gesture specifically focused on thinking through the materiality of transphobia and queerphobia in the reggaeton nightlife scene of Puerto Rico. And how we can perhaps think through the limits of what the representation of a queer-coded aesthetic can give us when those who are read as queer and trans on a daily basis face a very different reality in relation to those aesthetics. My perspective also comes as a diasporican, Miami-raised Floricua, Florida and Boricua, sociocultural linguist and linguistic anthropologist, interested in participatory artistic methods, queer and trans Puerto Rican performance. You already heard my intro, so I'm not going to read further along that. And more recently, in collaboration with my co-conspirator, Daniel Vasquez Sanabria, who's in the audience, a forthcoming chapter on Bad Bunny's performance repertoire, which is part of this kind of rehearsal of its development. I'm staging an analysis of his performance repertoire through this co-constructed concept with Daniel of queer dialogic intimacy, which defined as a mapping of intentionally curated engagement in discourses relevant to a queer and trans Puerto Rican public across multiple scales, drawing from Bakhtinian dialogism and linguistic anthropological theoretical ideas of intertextuality and interdiscursivity. So, in other words, what gets sutured together across various cultural texts in his repertoire, what kinds of texts become rendered in relation, and what types of discourses are particularly relevant to queer and trans social movement building in Puerto Rico become construed in citation in ways that reflect a type of intimate knowledge. And read here, not necessarily an intimate relationship with the queer and trans Puerto Rican community. I'm here reading intimacy through an expansive lens, not maybe the immediate one that indexes a type of idea about romance or sexual practice. So to frame us temporally, the examples I show also are reflective of a market shift in Bad Bunny's engagement with an aesthetically queer dialogic performance style in a post-Yo Perreo Sola discography. To start us off, although I already did, I want to kind of wade into the debate about the supposed queerness of Bad Bunny's aesthetic and the critiques that have accused him of queer baiting, and perhaps the danger, particularly now, especially as a Floridian, thinking through the diaspora and other panels. I'm sure we'll get to Florida. But as a Florida-raised Puerto Rican, I think we can all think about the dangers about essentializing what queer practices look like and how that ends up transforming into terms of state surveillance, carcerality, et cetera. And to echo Larry LaFontaine Stokes in an article in USA Today, and thinking about this particular debate with Bad Bunny's supposed sexuality and gender, in kind of these debates that essentialize identitarian terms, and I quote, "I don't like or use the term queer baits. It misses the point." He goes on to talk about a long history of, and I quote again, "flirtatiousness in the Hispanic world that goes well beyond American obsessions with rigid categories and gender orthodoxies," end quote. So I'm particularly interested in how Bad Bunny's various ways of identifying or refusing to use particular transparent forms of language, wading in the opaque perhaps, are generative for a queer politic within the genre of reggaeton. What is at stakes in essentializing what it means to look queer, dress queer, sound queer, and what that means in terms of describing what aren't queer ways of moving through the world enough. So while Bad Bunny has by no means any proximity to the ways that these questions are unavailable to Black women in particular, I've been thinking here through a conversation I had with Omaseke Natasha Tinsley, and if you haven't read her new book, The Color Pink, you should, who had me reflect on how folks haven't been listening to how Black women in particular tell us they're queer. So thinking through Megan Thee Stallion's conversation with Young Miami recently, if you haven't watched that, this is interesting conversations about topping and bottoming, if you're interested in those things. Or Cardi's discussion of her own bisexuality. We don't necessarily talk about Cardi as a queer figure, right? But she's definitely told us. So if we invested in kind of these white transparent modes of queer identification and don't listen to the modes of being queer or queer ways of being in the world, whether one identifies as queer or not in this kind of transparent way, we might risk reinscribing the very same types of logics that trans radical exclusionary feminists, TERFs, use to delineate what a real woman, a real man, or what real gender are. We might also risk playing into the hands of state institutions like the Florida Medical Board that seems to be doing everything but actually practicing medicine nowadays. But I'm interested in kind of divesting from this discourse around whether or not Bad Bunny is queer baiting and shifting towards how his potentially queer ways of being in the world reflect the type of intimate awareness, again, not necessarily relationship, especially in more recent performances, and those relationships to those performances and queer and trans social movements in the Puerto Rican archipelago. So I now move to discuss a grounded example to illustrate just a snippet, to see where this type of queer dialogic intimacy in Benito's performance repertoire, for me, is particularly relevant from a semiotic perspective. So I'm showing here Bad Bunny's performance in 2020 of The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, of Ignorantes with Sech, an interesting song, if we think about the title, to perform, where he wears a t-shirt that states, "Mataron a Alexa, no a un hombre con falda," referencing here the murder of Alexa Negron Luciano, a homeless Black trans woman from Puerto Rico, who was killed after being harassed at a McDonald's after being accused of peeping in a woman's restroom. The kind of, on one hand, counter-hegemonic discursive work, and on the other, counter-memory work to refuse the scripting of Alexa's death via the delegitimation of her transness, via the kind of juxtaposition of his own image as a man in a skirt, does the work of signifying how his performance repertoire has engaged a type of queer dialogic intimacy. I read that in the use of an idea of a man in a skirt as an important statement about ignorancia, thinking with the title of the song he was performing, found in the discourses circulating in police departments where she was repeatedly misgendered, despite the visual signifiers, again, what do we want to essentialize, una falda, that we risk to essentialize when we engage in these queer baiting discourses. And I'll return to this thought with my own experiences at a nightclub in San Juan. It was also a statement against the discourses that photographed her, posted her online, with the same language in those very police reports. I'm not really here to champion his allyship. I'm not here to endorse his GLAAD Vanguard Award, but to kind of just discuss with this concept of queer dialogic intimacy, what type of knowledge is necessitated to make this type of statement with the shirt, via the skirt, via its aesthetic political significance, to show that it's not just necessarily a simplistic gesture, right, but requires some type of knowledge of how to subvert transphobia. But as Nelari Figueroa Torres writes, as well as I encourage you to check out the work again of Daniel Vázquez Sanabria, he gets the credit, right, for telling the story of this Black Puerto Rican houseless trans woman's death, and the story becomes about him at the end of the day. Again, though, the complications of holding what the performance might do, though, in terms of the industry. So before I share in closing an autoethnographic account, I might, or how I might, or might not want to decenter Bad Bunny in certain ways of the analysis of my own kind of materiality and experience of transphobia in the industry. I wanted to share another example of how Bad Bunny's performance repertoire as of late reflects this queer dialogic intimacy that I'm thinking through. So here I'm showing 3 pictures of the 3-night concert series in El Choliseo this past summer in Puerto Rico. I was not in the Choli, but happily watching the concert from a live stream with a bunch of drag queens and queer folks in Santurce, which I felt was a better way to experience it. Also, I was tired and did not get tickets in time. I'm not salty. So I felt the collective, thinking about the physicality of this, I felt the collective guttural scream when Viana came on stage. So in many ways, I want to think about these concerts again, right, and more than just him. But on the 3 nights of his concert, he staged on different nights, Viana Ontiano, Young Miko, and Right Now, deliberate choices to celebrate queer women alongside a variety of other icons in reggaeton history, tracing for himself, his audience, and for Puerto Rico, a genealogy of a genre, and to return to the point of erotic autonomy, that allows for perreo to be a space to challenge who belongs in the art form, and we might discuss problematically so into the national imaginary. Okay, that's me. She's perra, I know. So I'm gonna move into kind of an autoethnographic account that moves me perhaps from discussing Bad Bunny's queer dialogic intimacy to do something on a larger platform of what it means for him to visibilize the queer movements in the genre of reggaeton, and also then recenter the actual transphobia, homophobia, and cis heteropatriarchal violence of the genre, and the limitations, right, of spending too much time reading Benito. So remember that I say his performance repertoire reflects relation, awareness, and knowledge, not necessarily intimacy in ways that signal a deeper care, a deeper level of enmeshment, etc. Down the grapevine, I've heard many of the collaborations, including those in recent music videos, which are not stories of mine to share in detail, but exactly that they were not the pretty picture we see of queer glitz and glamour that manifests itself as the cunty perreo, sorry, I'm not, but cunty perreo mini kiki ball we saw in the El Apagón music video. The account I'm going to tell rests on my experience beginning fieldwork on queer nightlife in San Juan this past summer of June 2022. I'm a Cancer, just to clarify. I was there on my birthday. Everything that comes with a Cancer, beware. I also have Gemini placements. So I had found out there'd be a full-on concert by Viana at 58 at the end of the month. So I arrived on my birthday and I was like, we need to go to this concert. It's the end of June, we're gonna do it. So naturally, I immediately reserved tickets for me and my friends. I asked him later, knowing he would have to say yes. That's a requirement to be friends with me. And as you can see in the picture, I looked great. I wore my little black shadow that I'm wearing again today. Signature white liner. Again, you're getting a lot of signatures from me. And I had a version of my black PR flag nails, which I've recreated in symposium fashion. I don't know if you can get that on camera, but you should. So I had on a mesh top over a thin t-shirt and biker style tights. This detail is important. The kind you see the Lulu girls wearing. So I arrived at 58 early because Viana told us to be on time, which is the first and last time I arrived early to a Puerto Rican event.
Yeah.
So after 3 hours of waiting in line, we finally are prompted to file up and begin scanning in with our tickets. The bouncer from far away looks me up and down and angrily yells, "No cortos," telling me that I had to go home, change, or face denial of entry. Again, shorts here is a misnomer. I said they were tights. We could just clarify what I was wearing. And I'm not here to argue semantics, although obviously I am, of what exactly I was or wasn't wearing. But because soon after I realized that it wasn't just me being yelled at and pointed out of line, through my flushed face, shock, and genuine fear from being physically gestured at in a way that felt like he didn't want me there and he would soon enact that, I saw a group of poncas and trans femmes were also being pulled out of line. Folks of a variety of gender presentations that I also started to see weren't matching the kind of binary gendered rubric he was using to police the space and its supposed dress code. In the moment, I stood beside them with my friend, who was fine because he's a cis man, he'll be all right, and started to kind of plot. I was fearful because the bouncer had pointed to us multiple times. I felt like at this point, the entire security team knew what I was wearing and looked like, and I trusted this kind of interior knowledge, which I theorized elsewhere through a kind of proprioceptive or interior body meaning-making and proprioceptive sign reading method called proprioceptive semiotic analysis via Nicholas Hartness for the linguistic anthropology girlies. To talk through how I trusted the way my body reacted to go home, change clothes, and eventually get back into that concert. Something I was able to do because I was there on university funds and could then charge that Uber to my research account later, right? So I have a particular type of mobility there that not everyone did. But this harassment, policing of gender expression, violent behavior was something that came up over and over again with interviews with trans folks who attended not only that concert, but the one later in Isla Verde with Viana and Tokisha that perhaps I don't have time to go into this example, Bad Bunny's kiss with his male dancer was referencing. And we can maybe talk about that later. So while I think I've given space to theorize Bad Bunny to an extent, I also want us perhaps to sit longer with what happens when those aesthetics in the reggaeton nightlife scene belong to folks that are non-ambiguously coded as gender non-conforming queer figures, and who the aesthetic play has limits for in terms of her proximity to the violences of transphobia in the industry. So I'll leave it there. Muchísimas gracias. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much to both of you for your fantastic presentations. I want to get us started by providing some comments and some responses to some things that were very key for me that I heard, and also insert a little bit of a discussion that we had off the stage upstairs when we were prepping for this. A little bit, and one of the things that I find really fascinating about this duo of folks, especially in the context of this panel, is that please notice that this is not queering Bad Bunny. This is a queering reggaeton panel, right? So it goes broader than Bad Bunny, and one of the first questions that I'm gonna ask you all to think about is like, why even, no? Why even bother with Bad Bunny as a locus to start understanding some of the potential politics that we are seeing. I really like to quote this book from 1993 that changed my life. It was called Making Things Perfectly Queer by Alexander Doty. And Alexander Doty tells us precisely what these two folks has done for us today. One, that we can historically situate specific cultural readings and uses of text by self-identified LGBTQ folks, like we've done with La Delphi and other folks that were named here today, and Villana. But we can also adopt reception positions that can be considered queer in some way, regardless of a person's declared sexual and gender alliances, right? So I think that that's a little bit of what is in contestation here, like declared part, because I think that we have so many moments in which we're like, oh, thank you, Bad Bunny, and so many other moments in which we're like, anybody else? No? in terms of what's happening. And Before I pass on the mic, I would really like to use this opportunity to bring to this space the analysis of two folk who are not academics and are also thinking with Bad Bunny. One of them is our beloved activist Lale Namero. I don't know if any of you have heard about Lale. Lale presented at NYU in 2018 talking about the feeling of going into el perreo combativo that night. And I really want to just bring that voice into this conversation so that we can continue to think beyond Bad Bunny about queer and reggaeton. And this is my translation. Lale Namero, at a panel titled Puerto Rican Summer Uprising, What Comes Next, that took place at NYU in 2019, was narrating the process of arriving to Old San Juan. As you arrived to Old San Juan and started to go up San Francisco Street, you could decide which perreo combativo you wanted to start participating in. There were calls that day for kissing and making out protests. There were calls for combative perreo in the steps of the Cathedral of San Juan en la Calle del Cristo. Two well-known DJs from the LGBTQ community, Perra Mística and Cállate, installed their equipment guerrilla style and started to play the music that makes the pelvis and the hips gyrate. Then the kissing, making out started. And the folks that were there began to cover up their faces and to go up the steps to start to twerk, bump, and grind. Others, perplexed, started to record with their cell phones to show what was happening through social media. Incredulity and Puritanism lasted very little, as they started to put their cell phones away and move their fanny packs to the side to allow their pelvis to bump and grind against the glutes of other comrades in the struggle. I have been waiting for this moment my whole life. So I just want to bring those words of how queer folks and perreo have come together throughout revolutionary times to lead the way, especially on the cathedral steps. And I also want to quote, and if you don't follow this page on Instagram, you should follow them right now, Leading Sub Services. They are one of the thinkers that is thinking about kinky education that is rooted in consent. And they have a few posts about Bad Bunny. And I find them really fascinating because they present Bad Bunny as, as somebody whose lyrics activate their queer kinky radar. We talk about a gaydar sometimes. Some of us who are in the kink community, we talk about a kink radar, right? So there's a lot of things that Bad Bunny says and does in their songs that activate this. Like, si tú me lo pides, there's a lot of si quieres, cuando quieras. There's a lot of that comes through that shows a disposition to obedience and to the desire to please others. And, in songs like Tenemos que hablar de por siempre, A tu merced, de yo hago lo que me da la gana, Qué malo, también de yo hago lo que me da la gana, Bellacoso, Me porto bonito, Un verano sin ti, Titi me preguntó, La neverita, Aguacero, Enséñame a bailar. All of those songs contain examples of what we are reading as his subbiness, his sub-tendencies in all of these songs. And this is something that our beloved Veronica is also writing and is going to publish something about soon. So I'm just going to stop right there with those few comments I just wanted to bring into the space and ask, why even bother?
My answer is going to be short. I don't. I skirted Bad Bunny and went straight to Dominican reggaeton, right? Sort of to signal one of the things that you're saying, right? Like part of Bad Bunny's sources, queer and non-queer, are rooted in Dominican versions of reggaeton and dembow. But importantly, the way that Dominican reggaeton has developed is in large part thanks to the queer community, right? And so there's a way in which what the queer folks, queer artists, and queer audiences are doing influences them both, and in turn, our most popular reggaeton artists. So I wanted to sort of not sit with Bad Bunny for a moment and sit with the folks that, when we talk about reggaeton and when we talk about Puerto Rican music, we forget that it's, Puerto Ricans of Dominican descent or Dominicans, right? And those migrations are key to understand our own musical production. I know Petra mentioned, right, that as well in her keynote. But so that's my response is I'm gonna go and visibilize and think with the queer Dominican folks and queer and Puerto Rican organizers.
Yeah, I think I'm interested with sitting with him because of the way he's kind of discursively positioned as the person who's queering reggaeton, right? And perhaps leading a departure from that to look at where the actual inspiration comes from, right? And I think there's where I got to this idea of the dialogic intimacy, like how particularly this performance repertoire reflects a type of knowledge that I don't think everyone has to be able to do particular subvertive moments, and not give him the credit, right, of exactly where I go with that type of argumentation. I think that's kind of the extent to which I sit with him. I didn't spend a lot of time going into folks like Ana Macho or Viana. Those are the folks that I write more about and I'm interested about. But I think I allow there to be a trajectory that gets me towards what folks consider the movement of the genre in particular gendered ways. And I think for me, living in California, in Santa Barbara, there's a way that Bad Bunny is kind of the locus of how people read queerness in Puerto Rico who don't know Puerto Rico. So entering that way to then redirect the conversation to folks like Viana is a way that I'm trying to center that engagement. So for me, it's a trajectory, not necessarily a focus point or an analysis of Bad Bunny, but a trajectory to perhaps redirect conversations about who we want to center and talk through.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Dosa, I feel hailed as a linguistic anthropologist, so I do have a question for you, but not specifically about interdiscursivity or, Bakhtin today. So your invocation of TERFs, of trans exclusionary radical feminists, as compared to, say, Black feminists like Natasha Tinsley or Jackie Alexander, or Black queer feminists who you also invoke, I think suggests this kind of plurality of feminisms, some of which sit in deep contradiction and tension with one another, and attack one another in different ways, or perhaps even unravel the notion of what feminism is as a concept and sort of serve as a proxy for state practice or state violence in different ways. And I'm curious about how you see that in the realm of queerness as well. If we think about what state, it seems as though you're pointing to a plurality of queernesses, some queer intimacies that might be connected to each other, but not necessarily invested in sustaining one another's well-being. So state queernesses, celebrity queernesses, academic queernesses, which I've encountered many colleagues who embrace queerness in some ways and not others, which is news to me. So anyway, and the queerness that lives in the McDonald's bathroom or in McDonald's, or the queerness that is in line to enter a venue, and what would it take to and you can imagine that same person who policed your person. Consuming Bad Bunny's performance, supporting Alexa, and not seeing their policing of your person as a contradiction to their consumption of that performance. And so I just wanted to ask you about how you see these queernesses in relation to one another.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Rosa. And I think there's a lot of tension in how I reckon with trying to answer the question simplistically, right? Or being able to really situate queerness as commodity, right? Which is kind of this thing that we have to reckon with folks like Bad Bunny. The dangly earring suddenly means something revolutionary to, the New York Times. I don't want to invoke particular publications necessarily, but the amount of credit that's given, right, to a dangly earring and a little drag, right? Which I was kind of impressed with the drag. I wasn't that impressed, but I was a little impressed. It was tight. The skirt was tight. It was body. So let me get back to the question. I think, though, in terms of reckoning with it's difficult to reckon with trying to think through a type of relation that signals an awareness of what's happening, but then also selling that as a product to an extent, right? Because I think that there's something to be said. I'm actually interested in, when we think about Bad Bunny and the concert venue and Coachella, what his dancers are doing a lot of the time, I think is much more interesting in terms of queer aesthetics than what he's doing, right? And I think he surrounds himself in that way, and I think that's part of this relation where he's aware, right, but not necessarily invested. And I don't know his investments on a personal way, but I think there is this tension between even the divergence from a black feminist politic that would think about a queer politic, which is quite different than selling queerness and when really reading their LGBTQIA plus identified types of being or aesthetics or things like that. I think that's different than the political investment, but it is still a type of relationship and awareness to what communities are doing on the ground and what that looks like, right? So I think it's why I've used kind of this trajectory to think with Bad Bunny, to then move towards, what are the material consequences when it's not a commodity anymore, right? And it's actually what I'm wearing, and I'm being threatened to be thrown out of a club, right? And this is at a concert for Villana, right? I think we can think about what happens when, and I didn't talk too much about this, but 58 is that venue, right, that reggaeton artists go to. This was where she did her full concert, but it's normally the venue that folks go for the after party, right? It's where Rosalia did an after party. We could talk about that. It's where Rao did an after party. Wisin y Yandel, right? 58 has hosted a lot of folks after these major concerts in Puerto Rico. And her full, a big kind of industry post-Bizarrap collab set was at 58. And that's the site where this is kind of extreme transphobia that I've heard echoed, not just me, but beyond me, right? So I think that there's a limit, right, to theorizing the queer types of institutional, commodified forms, and then what happens on the ground when those forms mean something different, when they live on the body and have consequences.
Okay, well, I just have a comment. Thank you for both of your papers. I think they connect very well, particularly in relation to the notion of queerness, but also different types of queerness, as you were discussing, but also violence. And as Veronica was reading her presentation, there was the moment when you say that a lot of these queer reggaetoneras actually performed not only their femme aesthetics, but also through media, right? And this offered them like some kind of protection. But I kept thinking, and I was going back to what happened to Kevin Fred, right? And the fact that the media did not protect him. It was actually the opposite, right? He made his declarations openly in media spaces. He used his songs to actually declare the hypocrisy of the gender, of the genre of reggaeton against openly queer folk, and the fact that many of these things, I mean, among men, identify males and gender males like happen in the down low when they happen. So I want you both to comment on that and why, I mean, in many cases, and I see your point, Veronica. There's areas in which safety and the media safety of certain publics is important. I mean, are important, and they come to the forefront, particularly in relation to respectability politics. But the case of Kevin Fred then becomes kind of like an example on how and why. I mean, sometimes it's the opposite. So I want you to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I focus on how, so the case of Kevin Fred is interesting, right? Because that like clear threat that he was for the sort of the discourse around masculinity that reggaeton has, right? I haven't seen a similar case in the Dominican Republic, and I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, right? But that has gotten social media attention like Gavin Fred's murder had. In the case of the Dominican women, because I concentrate on femme artists specifically because there's a different relationship. And yes, in media, but physically in the space. There's a different way in which femme and women Dominican dembow artists really would pay attention to what happened in the Villana concert, right? Like there is an awareness of this space might not be set up neither for women nor for queer folks, right? And that they're making sure that their audience is taken care of. There's a limitation to that, sure, and as they become more popular, I think they lose some ability to do that. But what I've observed in my research is there's something about a femme relationship with your audience. And also, Dominican dembow artists that are sort of more underground have made sure to go to the queer places. So not to the sort of normative reggaeton or dembow. They've done that too, but they insist on being in spaces that are already either built from queer communities or that have in some way stated that. Of course, that doesn't mean that there's not one-on-one violence, that there's no transphobia, that Dominican queer bodies are still, particularly outside of those spaces, violated, right, and in danger, right? The state continuously does that, and I'm here not even mentioning, right, Black and Haitian Dominicans, right? Yeah. If you are queer and Haitian in Hispaniola, right? Your identities are persecuted. But there's an instance, right, that I've noticed that doesn't happen in the recent femme and queer Puerto Rican reggaeton venues, which in part is because reggaeton is Puerto Rican, right? I think it's because there's been less space and resources given to other folks in our version of reggaeton, right? That's sort of what I've seen. That while these genres are still marginalized in the DR, the queer community has been able to do something more substantial with it.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I'm thinking about, I guess the idea of curation, like what happens when queerness becomes curated, particularly around that concert with Villana, right? It was a very different experience. I've seen Villana live before. The first time I saw her was at El Hangar, actually the park, El Gandul, like right next to it. And there was a post-party Kiki ball situation, and it was Ana Macho and Villana singing Muñeca. A very different experience, right, for who was in the crowd than at 58, where there was a lot more cis men, presumably straight, although I don't know what they were doing behind the curtains, than I've ever seen at a Villana concert. And I didn't talk about this, but there was something, I've written about this or thought about it in terms of the way that the venue also scripted her event, foreclosed the possibility to actually recognize her as having a long-standing discography, right? I've known Villana for years before she comes to the kind of industry legitimated venue. And what was interesting is that it was come see the artist of the Bizarrap collaboration, right? It was not see the artist of Muñeca. It was not see the artist that's sampling Venus Extravaganza in Pato Hasta la Muerte, right? It's come see this collaboration with, just see this song, right? And when the actual concert, I think, was for the girls, the queer folks, trans folks, because she played her whole discography. And there was this little kind of circle in the middle of 58 of queer fans that knew all the lyrics, where everyone else kind of, I don't know what they were doing, but they were definitely not singing the lyrics of anything but the Bizarrap collaboration, right? So I think even the venue, and then once that enters kind of the mediascape, the media sphere, right, things get lost because it's no longer grounded in these spaces like El Hangar, right? Or performing at a Kiki ball. So there's something there that once you enter a particular space and then there's industry folks involved in this curation, something gets lost, right? And it's sad. I think it's sad, and it's also foreclosing possibilities of the exact kind of reason of why I'm not super invested in centering Bad Bunny, but using him as a redirect to think about folks like Vienna, right? Because now having industry folks behind her, things change, right? And then the trans folks that were at the same venues I went to earlier are now at the center huddling and then having to go home and make strategic changes to ensure they're not gonna be, I don't know what, by the bouncer, right?
Thank you both. I just have a general question about one, homo nationalism, and then the other one being more about, I guess, audience and the way that queering can reproduce or produce different things for different audiences. So for me particularly, I don't like comparing or like equaling queer with trans for very obvious reasons, because I think Alexa's case was made into a queer case when it was a trans case. But I guess like, what happens when Bad Bunny is queered in one way, I guess in an academic venue, and then how that translates onto the people who are actually on the ground, or I guess like real queer people. I'm not saying that he's not queer, but people who live it on the daily and don't need to choreograph their queerness. I guess, como que, what do you both think, or all three, about this kind of maybe homo nationalism when we queer Bad Bunny, but then it's kind of not the same thing when other people are doing it? Because obviously Villana is not getting the same kind of track as Young Miko. And then Young Miko is also producing a very particular performance there that some people get a hard on for. And you don't necessarily need to be a woman for that one. But yeah, I guess that's the general question.
Thank you so much. Due to time, I think we're going to collect 2 questions.
I wanted to first, Celiani, your comments about how can we think differently from queer baiting, queer flirting, queer intimacy, these winks and nods, right? But what do we make of that when they exist next to a wink and nods of very traditional cis male hetero, sexuality as well? Is it just like an equal opportunity wink and nod, or is there something really transgressive about having those winks and nods in spaces where they're usually not present, right? So that question. And in terms of, I was so fascinated by the arrival story at 58, right? And it reminded me this might seem really random, but it reminded me when I went to see Hamilton on Broadway. I went with another Puerto Rican friend, first time I'd ever seen a Broadway show, been on Broadway. At the end of the thing, I had been eating snacks from the concession during the show, and the person in front of me was really mad, and I didn't know that. And then at the end, he turns around and says to me to go back to the trailer park.
Ouch.
And I was like, wait, what? But like, that's not even the right ghetto for me, you know? But I've never written about it, but I always really wanted to pull at that thread of what made this, like, who was a queer white man, feel so comfortable with the diversity on display that he was engaging in that diverse spectacle to the point where then he could police my presence there, right? And so it just really resonated with me, like what happens when this kind of safe performance of queerness makes people feel safe in their discriminatory or stereotypical actions.
I'm interested in the limitations of who's allowed to engage in a queer-coded aesthetic play, right? And I think that's what Daniela is getting us towards, to think about what happens when that becomes the symbol, right? When I'm in California, in sunny, expensive Santa Barbara, and Bad Bunny is the referent for Puerto Rican queerness, and not the folks who have been kind of doing this kind of transgression or counter-hegemonic practice. And thinking through this particular instance at 58, for me, I saw the bouncer as not just policing a dress code, but policing the genre, right? And I think that who was allowed to enter the space reflected who was assumed to be the regular kind of clientele at 58 when I entered. Because one thing I also noticed is that all the poncas and trans femmes arrived hours later, presumably because there were things that they had to do to be able to get in the same way I did. I was able to just get in my little Uber, go back to my Airbnb in Carolina, and then I like staying in Carolina. I don't like staying in San Juan. Daniela gets on me about this all the time. But I was able to do that quickly, right, and get back into the venue. And also, my body is read in particular ways, and it was read in particular ways in that moment that allowed me to do that a little bit more easily than other folks, right? Maybe not in this current outfit. You know, it's giving a particular a type of aesthetic that perhaps would be read differently in that moment, right? I wasn't wearing a wig. I didn't have long hair in that moment. He was happy to put me into a binary gender for the sake of allowing me to enter the venue. And I think that there's something there about how is the institution being kind of reconstituted and redefined in those moments and policed when folks don't allow or you know, kind of reject the presence of certain folks in a space. But yeah, that's where I'll go with it. And then
I just want to add to Jarimar's question the issue of consumption, right? But the brown bodies are on stage in Hamilton, Villana's trans body in 58, and some of the Dominican queer bodies that I talk about are there for consumption. And I mentioned a little bit how managers and producers build frameworks so that they can be consumed through the male gaze or as this like fantastic, magical like examples of these, you know, which are of course exoticizing, fetishizing, and exerting violence upon. So when queer bodies, and more specifically trans bodies, are not for the consumption, whether it's entertainment or sexual, then it becomes a problem, right? And this has happened for Black folks too, right? Like as long as they're on the minstrel stage, it's fine, right? But when they become actual human beings that you live with, right? When they're humanized, then it's a problem for white people. So I think a similar thing happens, and it's sort of what you are commenting about. And certainly, you know, a lot of the Dominican folks that I research have to contend with that, right? How do I market myself as a consumable product? But also, how do I take care of my trans audience and my, you know, transgressive in many other ways audiences?
Boom. We have one more question. One more question from online. Yes.
What kinds of challenges or opportunities exist for queer artists doing reggaeton in Puerto Rico versus dembow in the Dominican Republic? How are these spaces different or similar in terms of how communities are built, and what kinds of performances are embraced?
Yeah, I think that one of the main differences is what I mentioned in regards to from the outset in dembow, queer artists have been there. That was not an exception to the rule, right? We can think about the history of reggaeton as having exceptionally one woman and maybe two women, right? Exceptionally now, Villana and Young Miko are there. In Dominican dembow, they've always been there, right? And I think one is because the way that Dominican music works has always sort of lent itself to playfulness with gender. We see this in bachata, we see this in merengue, right? We see this in other forms. Yes, a lot of those are problematic. Again, they reify this like masculinist standpoint. They're still very transphobic. They're very misogynist. But I think that the queer dembow artists knew how to strategize around that, right? Knew what to do with, okay, I am going to be tokenized and I am going to be sort of fit into this power dynamic, but I can get inside the genre this way, right? And so they partner with those producers and managers. So someone like Lápiz Consciente, right, who is like very important for rap in the Dominican Republic. Supporting La Elfi was immense for her, right? There's this thing of I made it, the cis straight men accepted me. But she made it, and she was able to then get other people like Pajarita Paul, right? to do the same thing and to talk about their queerness, to perform their queerness in ways that sometimes are not easily consumable too, just to add more to what I mentioned, right? Sometimes La Elfie's not, like, the screaming dame leche, right? Yeah, it's fun, it's part of the genre, but it's still very uncomfortable for audiences. So not everyone gets to consume La Elfie as like an easy performer. That works very different in Puerto Rican reggaeton. I think also because when you get into the scene in PR, you're looking to go into Miami, right? There's a way in which this genre makes money, right? And the way that the studios and the labels have been created, they don't support people that don't conform to the misogynist and machista. They don't do that. And in the DR, queer people have been able to do that. Perhaps they're not going to make as much money as Bad Bunny, but they're able to perform in their country. They're able to tour, right? They have fans. You can look them up online, right? They are successful in their own country, even if they're not necessarily international artists. And what I've seen is that in Puerto Rico, we're always looking for international, like, this is a global genre, we need to get out there, and that comes with some complications.
Wow, amazing. Thank you. Yes, we did it. I would just like to provide one closing remark. I think that queerness is vast, is expansive. It allows so much. Bad Bunny opens the door for the neoliberal markets to be like, okay, vamos, okay, I can take it. Okay, Alexa, okay. Then what Veronica is talking about is that this unapologetically trans, non-binary, queer artists are adored and venerated by queer communities and looked upon. You have to see el corazón que se le sale a la gente cantando estas canciones en los balls, en cosas de draguealo, en todo tipo de actividades. Es que se le va la vida cantando esto, al igual que many of us sing out loud to many of the Bad Bunny songs, except for some folks. So I really want to thank both of you for your amazing insights today.